February 26, 1991. Second Lieutenant Patrick Maug is sitting in his M2 Bradley fighting vehicle, part of the 1st Brigade, 3rd Armored Division. They're pushing into Iraq, part of the massive ground offensive. Suddenly his radio explodes with panic voices. Friendlies, cease fire. 2 A-10 Warthogs just attacked their column. 2 Bradleys are burning. 6 American soldiers are dead. Another 14 are wounded. And the pilots had no idea they were hitting their own guys. Welcome back to Gulf War Chronicles. Today we're talking about something that doesn't get discussed much: friendly fire in Desert Storm. It's an uncomfortable topic, but it's important. Out of the 147 Americans killed in action during the Gulf War, 35 died from friendly fire. That's almost a quarter. 72 more were wounded by our own weapons. And the stories of how it happened are heartbreaking, frustrating, and reveal hard truths about modern warfare that we need to understand. Let me be clear right up front: this isn't about blaming anyone. Friendly fire has happened in every war in human history, but Desert Storm was supposed to be different. We had high-tech weapons, satellite navigation, advanced radios, thermal imaging. We could fight at night. We had total air superiority. And yet, Americans kept killing Americans. Why? That's what we're going to explore today. The single deadliest friendly fire incident of the war happened on February 27, 1991. That's the 3rd day of the ground war. The Battle of Norfolk was raging, one of the biggest tank battles of the entire conflict. The 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment was in heavy contact with the Tawakkalna Division of the Republican Guard. It was after midnight, pitch black, and the desert was lit up with tracer fire and explosions. Captain Joseph Twitty was commanding Company H, 3rd Battalion, 66th Armor Regiment. They were in M1 Abrams tanks, moving to support the 2nd ACR. Through the thermal sights they could see vehicles ahead, lots of them. The radio traffic was chaotic, everyone was in contact, everyone was shooting. Twitty's gunner, Staff Sergeant Nathaniel Wilson, had a Soviet-made vehicle in his sights. It looked like a BMP armored personnel carrier. Wilson asked permission to fire. Twitty gave the order. The 120mm sabot round left the barrel at over 1 mile per second. It hit the target dead center, and the vehicle exploded. A few seconds later, Twitty's radio came alive with a transmission that made his blood run cold. They just killed 2 soldiers from the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment. What they thought was an Iraqi BMP was actually an American Bradley fighting vehicle. In the thermal sight, at distance, in combat conditions, they looked almost identical. But that wasn't the only vehicle they hit. In the chaos of that battle, multiple American units fired on each other. By the time the sun came up, 9 American soldiers were dead from friendly fire at Norfolk. Staff Sergeant Nels Moller, Sergeant Garrett Mongrella, Specialist Steven Atherton, Private First Class Frank Allen walked. These were real guys with families back home. And they died because in the fog of war, the technology that was supposed to make everything clear didn't prevent the confusion. Here's what made friendly fire so common in Desert Storm. First, the sheer speed of the advance. The ground war moved faster than anyone expected. Iraqi resistance collapsed in most places. American units were racing forward, sometimes covering 100 miles or more in a day. Units weren't always where they were supposed to be on the map. The battlefield was fluid, constantly changing. You might think you're shooting at the enemy when you're actually shooting at the unit that got ahead of you. Second, the weather. We don't talk about this enough, but Desert Storm had terrible weather during the ground war. Smoke from the Kuwaiti oil fires that Saddam had set burning, dust storms, low clouds. Visibility was often terrible. The thermal sights could see through some of it, but not all. And when you're looking at a hot vehicle signature on a screen, trying to identify if it's friendly or enemy in seconds while people are shooting at you, mistakes happen. Third, and this is critical, the identification systems weren't good enough. Every American vehicle was supposed to have thermal panels or inverted V markings that would show up in thermal imaging. But in practice, these didn't always work. The panels would fall off during movement. They'd get covered in mud. And when you're looking at a vehicle from a mile away through a thermal sight, that little marking might not be visible anyway. Let me tell you about what happened to Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Hales. He was the battalion commander of 366th Infantry, 1st Infantry Division. On February 27th, his unit was moving north when they started taking heavy fire from the front. Hales saw muzzle flashes, saw vehicles shooting at his troops. His unit returned fire. It was dark, it was chaotic, and everyone was fighting for their lives. After the battle, they discovered they'd been in a firefight with 1st Squadron, 4th Cavalry Regiment, another American unit. The cavalry unit thought they were being attacked by Iraqis and fired back. Nobody on either side realized they were shooting at their own guys until the shooting stopped. One American soldier was killed, several wounded. The tragic thing: both units were doing exactly what they were trained to do, returning fire when engaged. The system failed them. Now let's talk about the air-to-ground friendly fire incidents, because these were different. When A-10s or helicopters or fast movers hit ground forces, the dynamics were totally different than ground units shooting each other. The aircraft had seconds to identify targets. They were moving fast or focusing on staying alive in a hover, and they were completely dependent on the information they were given. That incident I mentioned at the beginning with the A-10s hitting the Bradleys. Here's what happened. Two A-10 pilots from the 510th Tactical Fighter Squadron were on a mission to attack Iraqi targets. They'd been given coordinates and descriptions. They found vehicles matching the description in roughly the right area. They rolled in and fired. But what they hit was a column of American Bradleys from the 3rd Armored Division. Captains Randy Goff and Eric Salamonson. They had no idea. They did everything by the book. The problem was the battlefield was so fluid that the ground units weren't where the pilots expected friendly forces to be. And from the air, even with magnified optics, a Bradley can look an awful lot like a Soviet-built armored vehicle at certain angles. The pilots were devastated when they found out. Goff later said it was the worst moment of his life. Here's another one that really shows how complex this problem was. February 25, 1991. An Air Force EF-111 strike bomber was tasked with hitting Iraqi artillery positions. The crew found targets matching their briefing, vehicles with long tubes that looked like artillery. They dropped their bombs. Direct hits. Mission successful, except those weren't Iraqi artillery pieces. They were M109 self-propelled howitzers from the 1st Infantry Division, American artillery. The bombs killed 3 soldiers and wounded several others. The EF-111 crew had done everything right according to their training and briefing. The problem was the intelligence about where friendly forces were located was slightly wrong, and visually, from 20,000 feet, American and Iraqi artillery looked similar. This is the nightmare scenario for every pilot. You follow your orders perfectly, you think you're killing the enemy, and later you find out you killed your own guys. The worst air-to-ground incident involved British forces, and it shows just how deadly these mistakes could be. On February 26th, 2 American A-10 Warthogs attacked a British Warrior armored vehicle convoy from the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers. 9 British soldiers were killed, including Staff Sergeant John Kells, Lance Corporal of Horse Sean Taylor, and Trooper David Denbury. I'm naming them because these weren't just statistics. They were real people who died in a preventable tragedy. The British Warriors were marked with fluorescent panels specifically to prevent this kind of thing. But the A-10 pilots, who were operating in terrible visibility due to smoke from oil fires, didn't see the panels or didn't recognize them. They saw vehicles they thought were Iraqi. One pilot later said he saw what he believed was an orange rocket being fired at him. What he probably saw was the orange thermal panels on the British vehicles. He interpreted it as a threat and engaged. The tragedy was compounded because after the first A-10 attack, the British survivors tried to signal they were friendly. But the second A-10, seeing his wingman's attack and seeing what he thought was return fire from the ground, pressed his own attack. By the time anyone realized what was happening, 9 men were dead and many more were wounded. Now, there were also some incredible near misses that didn't result in casualties but easily could have. Lieutenant Colonel Michael Cobb was flying an AH-64 Apache on February 27th when he took fire from an American position. He saw the muzzle flashes, saw rounds coming at his helicopter. He was about to return fire with his 30mm cannon when something made him hold off. He called on the radio and barely got through to the ground unit in time. They thought his Apache was an Iraqi Hind helicopter. If he'd fired back, Americans would have killed Americans. Another near miss happened with Marine Harrier jets. On February 25th, 2 Harriers were coming back from a mission when they were engaged by a Patriot missile battery. The Patriot system, which was designed to shoot down incoming Scud missiles, locked onto the Harriers and fired. One Harrier was hit, and the pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Curtis Myrie, had to eject. He survived, but he came within seconds of being killed by an American missile system that misidentified his aircraft as a threat. Let's talk about tank-on-tank friendly fire for a minute, because this was actually less common than you'd think, but when it happened, it was devastating. The M1 Abrams has such a powerful gun that, when it hits another armored vehicle, there's usually not much left. Captain Scott Bryant was commanding an Abrams in the 3rd Armored Division when his tank was hit by another Abrams from behind. The sabot round went clean through his tank. By some miracle, it missed everyone inside, but it destroyed critical systems. If the angle had been slightly different, his whole crew would have died. The Marine Corps had their share of friendly fire incidents too. On February 29, 1991, the last day of the ground war, Marines from Task Force Grizzly were hit by American artillery fire. The forward observer had called in coordinates for an Iraqi position, but the coordinates were slightly wrong, or the units had moved, or something got confused in the relay. The shells landed on American positions. 7 Marines were wounded, and it was pure luck that nobody was killed. One of the most controversial friendly fire incidents involved the Highway of Death. You probably remember the images. The road from Kuwait to Basra absolutely devastated. Hundreds of destroyed vehicles. One of the most iconic images of the war. Well, some of the vehicles hit in those attacks were actually Kuwaiti civilian vehicles that had been stolen by Iraqi troops. And in the chaos, there are reports that some American vehicles that had gotten ahead of the main advance were also hit. The Pentagon has never fully confirmed this, but veterans I've talked to say they saw American equipment among the wreckage. Here's what's really important to understand. After the war, the military did extensive analysis of every friendly fire incident. They weren't trying to cover anything up. They were trying to learn. And what they found was sobering. Even with all our technology, even with our training, even with our overwhelming superiority, we still killed our own people at a rate that was actually higher than some previous wars when you look at it as a percentage of total casualties. Why? Several reasons came out of the analysis. First, the high tempo of operations meant there wasn't always time for perfect coordination. Second, the technology gap. Our night vision and thermal imaging meant we could fight in conditions we'd never fought in before, but the identification systems hadn't caught up. We could see the enemy at night now, but we still couldn't always tell friend from enemy on those screens. Third, the all-volunteer force meant we had well-trained soldiers, but many of them had never been in combat before. Desert Storm was their first time being shot at, and in that stress, mistakes happen. The Air Force did a particularly detailed study of the air-to-ground incidents. What they found was that most of them involved a combination of factors: bad weather reducing visibility, inaccurate intelligence about friendly positions, time pressure to hit targets quickly, and pilots who were tired after flying multiple missions per day. It wasn't one thing. It was a perfect storm of factors that came together in tragic ways. One thing that emerged from all this was something called combat identification, or CID, became a huge priority for the military after Desert Storm. The services invested billions in trying to develop better systems to prevent friendly fire. Things like Blue Force Tracker that shows where all your units are on a digital map. better thermal panels for vehicles, improved radio systems, stricter rules of engagement that required more positive identification before shooting, training that specifically focused on recognizing friendly vehicles. Did it work? Well, yes and no. In the Iraq War that started in 2003, friendly fire still happened, but the rate went down significantly. The systems were better, the training was better, commanders were more aware of the risk, but you can never eliminate it completely. War is chaos, things happen fast, people make mistakes, and sometimes technology fails. I want to read you something. This is from the official after-action review by the 3rd Armored Division about the friendly fire at Norfolk. Quote, "The tragedy of fratricide is that professional soldiers, trained to a fine edge, motivated to fight and determined to win, kill their own comrades in what they believe is the right action. There are no bad guys, no one to blame, just a terrible accident of war that shatters units and leaves mental scars that may never heal." End quote. That's really the heart of it. These weren't bad soldiers. They weren't cowards or criminals. They were professionals doing their jobs in impossible circumstances. Captain Twitty, who gave the order that killed 2 men at Norfolk, he had to live with that for the rest of his life. The A-10 pilots who hit the British warriors, they followed orders and did what they thought was right. The artillery crews who dropped shells on Marines, they were firing at coordinates they'd been given. But here's the thing we need to remember. Those 35 Americans who died from friendly fire, they're just as dead as the ones killed by Iraqis. Their families mourn just the same. And in some ways, it was harder for those families because there was no enemy to be angry at. It was just tragedy, just the cruel randomness of combat. The lessons from Desert Storm friendly fire are still being studied today. Every military in the world looks at what happened in 1991 and tries to learn from it. Combat identification is now a standard part of every major weapons program. The technology is better. The doctrine is better. But soldiers and Marines and pilots in Ukraine right now, they're still dealing with this same problem. It hasn't gone away. If you served in Desert Storm and remember any of these incidents, or if you had friends who were affected by friendly fire, I know this video probably brought up some tough memories. This is part of the history too, not just the victories and the heroic moments, but the mistakes and the tragedies and the things that went wrong despite everyone's best efforts. The soldiers who died from friendly fire deserve to be remembered just like all the others. Staff Sergeant Nels Moller, Specialist Steven Atherton, Private First Class Frank Walkt, Captain Jonathan Edwards, all of them. They served their country, they went to war, and they died in combat. The fact that they were killed by their own side doesn't make their sacrifice any less real. Thanks for watching this difficult episode of Gulf War Chronicles. If you want to honor the memory of those who served in Desert Storm, including those lost to friendly fire, leave a comment below. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. We're committed to telling the complete story of this war, even the parts that are hard to talk about. I'll see you in the next one.